The mahogany conference table stretched like a battlefield, and my sister Victoria sat at its head wearing a smile that could cut glass. 23 board members in $1,000 suits had just voted to strip me of everything I'd built over 15 years. The manufacturing empire that employed 12,000 people across 4 states. The defense contracts that kept half of Birmingham running. The legacy our grandfather started in a converted airplane hangar in 1952. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Motion carried, Victoria announced, her voice crisp as starched cotton. Michael Hayes is hereby removed from all operational duties, effective immediately. I didn't flinch, couldn't show weakness. Not here. Not after what I'd survived in Kandahar, in boardrooms from Detroit to Dubai, in the trenches of American manufacturing, where most people with Harvard MBAs wouldn't last a week. But then the conference room door opened. A young assistant stepped inside, face pale, hands trembling slightly as he approached Victoria's chair. He leaned down and whispered something that made her confident expression crack like thin ice. She looked up, scanning the room until her eyes found mine. For the first time in 20 years, I saw fear there. The assistant cleared his throat and spoke to the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development. Sir, General Hayes has arrived." 23 board members turned toward the door. 23 faces that had just condemned me suddenly shifted from smugness to something approaching reverence. And that's when everything changed. The smell of motor oil and sawdust was the first thing I remembered about Hayes Manufacturing. Not the corporate cologne that filled these boardrooms now, but the honest scent of work being done by people who understood the weight of metal and the precision of measurement. I was 7 years old when Grandfather Hayes first brought me to the original facility in Bessemer, Alabama. The plant floor stretched out like a mechanical cathedral, with overhead cranes moving massive steel beams through shafts of dusty sunlight. The sound was overwhelming. Hammering, welding, the hiss of hydraulics. But underneath it all was a rhythm, a heartbeat that would define the next 30 years of my life. "Listen to that, Michael," he said, his weathered hand resting on my shoulder. "That's the sound of America building itself stronger." Hayes Manufacturing had started with a single contract to produce aircraft components for the military in 1952. By the time I was old enough to understand what Grandfather had built, we were one of the premier defense contractors in the Southeast, specializing in precision metalwork for everything from naval vessels to aerospace systems. The company employed over 8,000 people and had manufacturing facilities in Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, and North Carolina. But it wasn't the numbers that mattered to me as a kid. It was watching Grandfather walk through the plant floor, knowing every worker by name, understanding every process from raw material to finished product. He'd stop at a machining station and run his fingers along a piece of steel, feeling for imperfections that instruments might miss. He'd discuss metallurgy with engineers who had PhDs, then turn around and solve a workflow problem with a floor supervisor who'd never finished high school. "The business isn't the building or the contracts," he told me one afternoon as we watched a team install a new CNC machine. "It's the people who show up every day and make something better than it was yesterday." Victoria was there that day too, but she was more interested in the air conditioning in Grandfather's office than the machinery that paid for it. 3 years younger than me, she'd inherited our mother's sharp intelligence and our father's natural charm. But she looked at the manufacturing floor the way some people looked at a necessary evil, something that existed to fund the life she actually wanted to live. "It's so loud," she complained when Grandfather suggested she spend the summer learning the basics of production management. "And it smells weird." "That's progress you're smelling," he replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. While Victoria spent her teenage years focused on debate team and student government, I was learning welding from Jimmy Rodriguez, a Vietnam veteran who'd been with the company since 1973. While she was choosing between Ivy League schools for her business degree, I was working 16-hour shifts during summer breaks, understanding how raw steel became the hull plates that would protect sailors in hostile waters. By the time I graduated from Auburn with a degree in mechanical engineering, I could read a blueprint like sheet music and spot quality control issues from 50 feet away. I understood the difference between military specifications and commercial standards, knew which suppliers could deliver under pressure, and which ones folded when deadlines got tight. But more importantly, I understood the people who made it all work. There was Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 who ran the most efficient welding crew in the Southeast. She could look at a production schedule and immediately spot the bottlenecks that would cost us time and money. When corporate consultants suggested automating her department, I spent 3 weeks proving that her team's flexibility and problem-solving ability were worth more than any robot. There was David Park, a young metallurgist who developed a new alloy composition that made our armor plating 30% lighter without sacrificing protection. The big defense contractors had tried to poach him twice, but he stayed because he knew his innovations would actually be implemented here, not buried in committee reviews. There was Bobby Chen, our logistics coordinator, who'd built relationships with transportation companies across the country. When Hurricane Katrina shut down the Gulf Coast, Bobby had our materials rerouted through alternate shipping lanes before our competitors even realized there was a problem. These weren't just employees. They were craftsmen, engineers, problem solvers, who took pride in work that actually mattered. When our hull plates protected a destroyer in the Persian Gulf, when our landing gear assemblies brought transport planes safely home, when our armor systems saved lives in convoy operations, that wasn't just business to them. It was a mission. Victoria never understood that connection. She saw the bottom line, the profit margins, the quarterly reports that impressed Wall Street analysts. When she joined the company full-time after finishing her MBA at Wharton, she immediately started talking about optimization and efficiency metrics and streamlining legacy processes. "We're leaving money on the table," she told our father during one of their weekly strategy meetings. "These personal relationships are inefficient. We could cut costs by 20% just by standardizing vendor contracts and implementing automated quality control." "Those personal relationships are how we deliver on impossible deadlines," I countered. "When the Navy needs emergency repairs on a carrier group, they don't call us because of our automated systems. They call us because Jimmy Rodriguez can have a repair crew in Norfolk in 6 hours, and Maria Santos can fabricate replacement parts that will outlast the original specifications." Victoria rolled her eyes. "That's exactly the kind of cowboy mentality that keeps us from scaling efficiently." But the results spoke louder than her MBA theories. Under my operational leadership, our on-time delivery rate was 97%. Our defect rate was less than half the industry standard. Our employee retention was so high that we had waiting lists for open positions. Most importantly, our reputation in the defense community was unshakable. When General Patricia Morrison needed emergency support for a classified operation in 2019, she didn't go through the normal procurement channels. She called me directly because she knew Hayes Manufacturing could deliver what others couldn't, when others wouldn't. "Michael," she said during that secure phone call, "I need components that don't exist yet, manufactured to specifications I can't fully disclose, delivered to a location I can't reveal, on a timeline that would be impossible for anyone else." "When do you need them?" I asked. "Yesterday." "They'll be ready tomorrow." And they were. Because I didn't just manage Hayes Manufacturing. I understood it, lived it, breathed it. Every machine, every process, every person was part of a system I'd spent 15 years perfecting. Not through corporate restructuring or efficiency consulting, but through showing up every day at 5:30 in the morning, walking the plant floor, listening to problems, implementing solutions, and never asking anyone to do something I wouldn't do myself. Victoria saw that success and interpreted it as evidence that the company was ready for the next level. Bigger contracts, public trading, expansion into commercial markets. She started talking about bringing in outside investors, modernizing our image, positioning Hayes Manufacturing as a major player in the global defense industry. "We're thinking too small," she argued during board meetings. "Michael's done amazing work getting us to this level, but operational management and strategic leadership require different skill sets." She wasn't wrong about that. I was better with blueprints than spreadsheets, more comfortable in steel-toed boots than Italian leather shoes. When defense contractors wanted to wine and dine potential partners at exclusive resorts, I preferred straightforward meetings in conference rooms, where we could focus on capabilities and timelines. But what Victoria didn't understand, what her MBA education and Wall Street connections couldn't teach her, was that in the defense industry, trust wasn't built in boardrooms. It was forged in the crucible of impossible deadlines, life-or-death specifications, and the absolute certainty that when someone's life depended on your work, you would deliver. That foundation wasn't just business philosophy, it was the bedrock of everything Hayes Manufacturing represented. And over the next few years, as Victoria's influence grew and her ambitions expanded, I would learn just how quickly someone could mistake that foundation for something they could build upon, rather than something they needed to protect. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The call came at 2:15 in the morning on a Tuesday in March 2018. Admiral Sarah Mackenzie's voice cut through the darkness with the kind of urgency that made your blood run cold. "Michael, we have a situation. The USS Hampton suffered catastrophic damage during a training exercise. The main engine mount is compromised, and we're looking at a 6-month repair timeline through normal channels." I was already reaching for my clothes. "What's the real timeline, Admiral?" "Carrier group deploys in 3 weeks. This ship doesn't make it, we're down 20% of our Pacific defense capability. Send me the damage assessment. I'll have a solution by morning." That phone call became the foundation of what the defense community would later call the Hampton Miracle. Within 18 hours, I had teams working around the clock in 3 different facilities. Maria Santos led a crew that fabricated replacement mount assemblies using a titanium steel hybrid that was actually stronger than the original specification. David Park developed a new welding technique that could be performed underwater, allowing repairs to begin while the ship was still in dry dock. But the real innovation came from Bobby Chen's logistics coordination. Instead of shipping components separately and assembling on site, he arranged for a specialized transport that could carry the entire pre-assembled unit. When the Hampton's repair crew saw a massive steel assembly being lowered into place by crane, perfectly fitted and ready for installation, they knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. 15 days later, the USS Hampton left Norfolk ahead of schedule. Not only had we met an impossible deadline, but our modifications made the ship's engine mount system more robust than it had ever been. The Navy's stress tests showed performance improvements across every metric. Admiral Mackenzie didn't just send a thank you letter. She recommended Hayes Manufacturing for the Navy's Advanced Manufacturing Partnership Program, a designation that put us in direct competition with defense giants like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. For a family-owned company from Alabama, it was like being invited to play in the major leagues. The recognition opened doors that had been locked for decades. General Patricia Morrison brought us into a classified project developing next-generation armor systems for ground vehicles. The Air Force contracted us to produce precision components for their new stealth fighter program. Even the Coast Guard, notoriously budget-conscious, approved our proposals for upgraded patrol vessel modifications. But success in the defense industry isn't just about capabilities. It's about relationships built on absolute trust. When General Morrison needed emergency support for operations she couldn't discuss over unsecured channels, she knew I would deliver without asking questions that couldn't be answered. When Admiral Mackenzie faced congressional budget hearings that threatened fleet readiness, she could point to Hayes Manufacturing as proof that American ingenuity could solve problems that money alone couldn't fix. By early 2020, our revenue had grown by 240% over 3 years. We'd expanded our workforce to 12,000 employees across 6 facilities. Industry publications were calling us the most innovative mid-sized defense contractor in America. The Pentagon had fast-tracked our security clearances for projects so classified that even I didn't know all the details of what we were building. Victoria watched this growth with the calculating eyes of someone who understood that momentum was opportunity. She'd been working behind the scenes, building relationships with investment bankers, corporate lawyers, and strategic consultants who specialized in scaling family businesses into publicly traded corporations. Look at these numbers, Michael, she said during one of our quarterly reviews, spreading financial projections across the conference table like a general planning and invasion. We're leaving billions on the table by staying privately held. With the right capital investment, we could triple our manufacturing capacity within 2 years. She wasn't wrong about the numbers. Defense spending was increasing, and there was more demand for our services than we could currently meet. But Victoria's vision of growth involved partnerships with larger contractors, standardization of our processes, and integration into supply chains that would make us more efficient but less flexible. Efficiency isn't our competitive advantage, I reminded her. Adaptability is. When the Navy needs something that doesn't exist yet, they don't call us because we're the cheapest option. They call us because we can solve problems that other companies can't even understand. And imagine what we could accomplish with 10 times the resources, she countered. Instead of being the best small contractor, we could be competitive with the major players. The tension between Victoria's ambitions and my operational focus came to a head during the Pentagon's annual Defense Innovation Conference in late 2020. Hayes Manufacturing had been invited to present our latest developments in adaptive manufacturing technology, a recognition that put us on the same stage as companies with 50 times our budget. Victoria wanted to use the presentation to announce our expansion plans and attract potential investors. I wanted to focus on the technical innovations that had earned us the invitation in the first place. The compromise we reached satisfied neither of us, but demonstrated our growing dysfunction as a leadership team. The presentation itself was a success. Our demonstration of rapid prototype armor systems drew standing ovations from military engineers who understood the implications of what they were seeing. When General Morrison introduced me to defense contractors from allied nations, the conversations immediately shifted to potential collaborations on international projects. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. As I was packing up our display materials, a young Marine Corps captain approached with the kind of respectful formality that military personnel reserve for senior officers. "Sir, Captain Rodriguez, 2nd Battalion Engineers. I wanted to thank you personally." "For what, Captain?" "My unit deployed with vehicle armor modifications your company produced. 2 months ago, our convoy hit an IED outside Kabul. The blast would have killed 3 Marines if not for your armor upgrades." He paused, composing himself. "Those Marines went home to their families because of work that happened in your facility." That conversation reminded me why Hayes Manufacturing mattered beyond profit margins and growth projections. We weren't just building components. We were protecting people who put their lives on the line for American interests around the world. Every weld, every specification, every quality control check was connected to someone's spouse, someone's parent, someone's child coming home safely. Victoria saw the same conversation differently. As we flew back to Birmingham, she focused on the international interest our presentation had generated. "Did you hear what the Canadian procurement officer said? They're looking for a primary contractor for their next-generation naval program. That's a $12 billion opportunity over 8 years." "Did you hear what Captain Rodriguez said?" I asked. 3 Marines are alive because we got the specifications right." "Of course that matters, Michael. But if we had the capacity to produce twice as much armor, we could protect 6 Marines instead of 3. Her logic was sound, but it missed the fundamental truth about what made Hayes Manufacturing successful. Our reputation wasn't built on scale. It was built on the absolute certainty that when someone needed something done right, we would deliver. That certainty came from personal relationships, institutional knowledge, and a company culture that treated every project as mission-critical. The defense industry is small, and news travels fast. Within 6 months of the Pentagon conference, Hayes Manufacturing was being courted by defense contractors, private equity firms, and international suppliers who saw our innovations as valuable additions to their portfolios. Victoria fielded these inquiries with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting her entire career for this level of attention. Meanwhile, I focused on what I did best, ensuring that our growing reputation was backed by consistent excellence. When the Navy increased our contracted production by 60%, I hired additional quality control supervisors and implemented new testing protocols. When the Air Force requested modifications to our stealth fighter components, I brought in specialized metallurgists and expanded our research capabilities. By the end of 2021, Hayes Manufacturing was operating at the peak of its capabilities. Our on-time delivery rate remained above 95% despite increased volume. Our employee satisfaction scores were the highest in company history. Most importantly, our innovations were being implemented across multiple branches of the military, protecting American service members in ways that would never make headlines but would always matter. Waysby lulls, the success felt sustainable, earned, and authentic. We were still the company that Grandfather Hayes had envisioned, a place where American ingenuity and craftsmanship created solutions that made the world safer. I didn't realize that Victoria was already planning to transform everything we'd built into something entirely different. The first sign that everything was about to change came disguised as good news. Victoria walked into my office on a gray Monday morning in February 2022, carrying a leather portfolio that looked expensive enough to fund a small manufacturing operation. "I've been accepted into the Department of Defense's Strategic Leadership Fellowship," she announced, setting the portfolio on my desk with the careful precision of someone placing a chess piece. 6 months in Washington, working directly with Pentagon procurement officials. I looked up from the production schedules I'd been reviewing. "Congratulations. That's quite an honor." "It's more than an honor, Michael. It's an opportunity to understand how defense contracting really works at the highest levels. The relationships that drive billion-dollar decisions. The strategic thinking that shapes national security policy." There was something in her tone that made me set down the schedules and give her my full attention. Victoria had always been ambitious, but this felt different. More calculated, like she'd been planning this conversation for weeks. "When do you start?" "Next month. They want me to focus on modernization initiatives, how traditional defense contractors can adapt to emerging technologies and changing geopolitical priorities." She paused, watching my reaction. They specifically mentioned Hayes Manufacturing as an example of innovative mid-size companies that could benefit from strategic guidance. The fellowship was legitimate. I'd heard of the program, a Pentagon initiative to bring fresh perspective to defense procurement by rotating civilian executives through key positions. What bothered me wasn't the opportunity itself, but the way Victoria presented it, as if Hayes Manufacturing needed strategic guidance from people who had never built anything more complex than a PowerPoint presentation. 6 months is a long time to be away from day-to-day operations, I observed. That's exactly why this timing is perfect. You've got operations running so smoothly that the company can function without constant oversight. She opened the portfolio and pulled out a thick document. "I've already prepared transition protocols and interim management structures." I glanced at the document. 50 pages of organizational charts, reporting hierarchies, and communication protocols that looked like they'd been designed by someone who had never worked a manufacturing floor but had definitely attended graduate courses in corporate management. "Victoria, we've never needed interim management structures. We need people who understand metallurgy, logistics, and quality control, not org charts. And that's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps us from reaching our full potential." Her voice carried a slight edge, the tone she'd used as a teenager when she was certain she was the smartest person in the room. Successful companies don't depend on irreplaceable individuals. They build systems that create consistency regardless of personnel changes. Over the next month, as Victoria prepared for her fellowship, I watched her implement changes that she described as operational improvements, but felt more like preparation for something larger. She hired Amanda Chen, a consultant from Boston who specialized in organizational efficiency optimization. She brought in Dr. Richard Lawson, a former McKinsey partner who had worked with defense contractors on strategic positioning initiatives. These consultants moved through Hayes Manufacturing, like anthropologists studying an unfamiliar culture. They attended production meetings with tablets and voice recorders, taking notes on conversations they clearly didn't understand. Amanda Chen asked Jimmy Rodriguez to explain his welding process in terms that could be documented for training purposes. Dr. Lawson wanted Maria Santos to quantify her crew's productivity using metrics that had nothing to do with the quality of work they actually produced. "They're trying to turn craftsmanship into an algorithm," Maria told me during one of our weekly walkthrough meetings. Amanda asked me to create a flow chart showing how I decide when a weld is ready for stress testing. I told her, you know it's ready when it looks right, feels right, and sounds right when you tap it with a hammer. She asked me to define looks right in measurable terms. The consultants produced reports that praised Hayes Manufacturing's impressive operational metrics while identifying, quote, significant opportunities for process standardization and scalability enhancement. Their recommendations read like a blueprint for transforming our company into something that would be more recognizable to Wall Street analysts but completely foreign to the people who actually made it work. Victoria presented these recommendations to our board of directors, which consisted of me, her, our father Thomas Hayes, and 3 longtime advisors who had been with the company since grandfather's era. The board meetings, which had traditionally been informal discussions over coffee and financial updates, suddenly became presentations with slide decks and strategic planning documents. The fellowship has given me access to Pentagon officials who make procurement decisions worth hundreds of billions of dollars, Victoria explained during her first report back from Washington. But they're increasingly focused on contractors who can demonstrate scalable capabilities and predictable delivery systems. We've never missed a delivery deadline, I pointed out. Individual excellence isn't enough anymore, Michael. They want partners who can integrate with larger strategic initiatives, companies that can grow with expanding mission requirements. The real disruption came when Victoria returned from Washington with news that sounded like an opportunity but felt like a threat. She'd been invited to present Hayes Manufacturing's capabilities to a joint procurement committee that was evaluating contractors for a new class of naval vessels. The contract was worth $12 billion over 8 years, by far the largest opportunity in our company's history. This is what we've been building toward, she announced during a hastily called board meeting. Everything we've accomplished, all the recognition we've earned, has positioned us for this moment. The contract details were staggering. The Navy wanted a primary contractor who could coordinate multiple subcontractors, manage complex supply chains, and deliver components for 43 vessels on a precise timeline that aligned with broader fleet modernization goals. It was the kind of project that could transform Hayes Manufacturing from a regional contractor into a major defense industry player. But it was also the kind of project that would transform Hayes Manufacturing into something completely different from what grandfather Hayes had built, what our employees understood, and what our military clients valued about us. The procurement committee isn't just evaluating our manufacturing capabilities, Victoria continued. They're assessing our corporate structure, our scalability, our ability to integrate with prime contractors who work on multiple continents. She pulled out another document, this one even thicker than her fellowship portfolio. I've been working with Dr. Lawson and Amanda Chen to develop a comprehensive restructuring plan that would position us to win this contract. I skimmed the restructuring plan and felt something cold settle in my stomach. The document proposed creating separate divisions for manufacturing, logistics, and client services. It recommended bringing in senior executives with experience at major defense contractors. Most significantly, it suggested establishing a corporate headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, to be closer to Pentagon decision-makers. Victoria, this isn't expansion. It's a replacement. You're talking about dismantling everything that makes Hayes Manufacturing successful and rebuilding it to look like every other major contractor. I'm talking about evolution, Michael. The defense industry is changing, and companies that don't adapt get left behind. Our father, who had been quietly listening from the head of the conference table, finally spoke. What would happen to our current operations? The plants, the workers, the relationships we've built? Everything would be preserved, Victoria replied quickly. But we'd integrate them into a larger framework that could support much bigger projects. And who would run this larger framework? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Victoria's pause lasted just long enough to confirm my suspicions. The Navy's procurement committee made it clear that they want to work with executives who understand strategic planning at the Pentagon level. My fellowship has given me relationships and insights that would be essential for managing a contract of this magnitude. That's when I understood what had really happened during Victoria's 6 months in Washington. She hadn't just learned about Pentagon procurement, she'd positioned herself as the solution to a problem she was simultaneously creating. The fellowship, the consultants, the restructuring plan, even the $12 billion contract opportunity, They were all pieces of a strategy designed to transform Hayes Manufacturing into a company that would need Victoria's particular skills more than it needed mine. She wasn't just proposing to expand our business. She was engineering a takeover that would look like progress to anyone who didn't understand what we'd be losing in the process. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Our 3 board advisors, men who had known Grandfather Hayes personally and had watched me grow up on the manufacturing floor, looked uncomfortable in ways that had nothing to do with the leather chairs or the air conditioning. Finally, Harold Morrison, our longest-serving advisor, cleared his throat. "This is certainly ambitious, Victoria, but it's also a fundamental change in company direction. I think we need time to consider all the implications." Victoria nodded graciously, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. She'd planted the seed, established the stakes, and created urgency around a decision that would reshape everything our family had built. As the meeting ended and board members filed out with copies of the restructuring plan, Victoria gathered her materials with the satisfied efficiency of someone who had just won the opening round of a much larger battle. "Change is never easy, Michael," she said as she reached the door, "but this is our chance to build something that could last for generations." After she left, I sat alone in the conference room, staring at the restructuring document and thinking about Grandfather Hayes's words from 30 years earlier. "The business isn't the building or the contracts. It's the people who show up every day and make something better than it was yesterday." Victoria's plan would make Hayes Manufacturing bigger, more profitable, and more impressive to Pentagon procurement committees. But it would also make it unrecognizable to the people who had built its reputation one weld, one delivery, one impossible deadline at a time. The disruption had arrived wearing a smile and carrying a briefcase full of opportunities that looked exactly like threats. The changes started small, subtle enough that I almost missed them. Victoria returned from her Pentagon Fellowship with a new title, Vice President of Strategic Development, and an assistant named Jennifer Walsh, who had previously worked for Northrop Grumman's Government Relations Division. Jennifer's job, according to the official announcement, was to high-level stakeholder communications and strategic partnership initiatives. What that meant in practice was that phone calls I used to receive directly were now being filtered through Jennifer's office. When Admiral Mackenzie called about urgent modifications to the Pacific Fleet's armor specifications, Jennifer scheduled a preliminary consultation meeting for the following week. When General Morrison needed emergency components for a classified operation, Jennifer requested a formal proposal with timeline estimates and cost projections. "It's just a better organization," Victoria explained when I brought up the communication delays. "Jennifer ensures that all stakeholder interactions are properly documented and aligned with our strategic objectives." "Our strategic objectives are to deliver what our clients need when they need it," I replied. "Admiral Mackenzie doesn't have time for preliminary consultation meetings when she's dealing with operational emergencies. And that's exactly the kind of reactive approach that prevents us from building sustainable client relationships," Victoria countered. Jennifer's background at Northrop gives her insights into how major contractors manage high-level military relationships. The second change was more visible, but equally concerning. Victoria hired Marcus Thompson, a former Boeing executive, as our new Director of Operations Analytics. Marcus arrived with a mandate to, implement data-driven decision-making protocols across all manufacturing processes. Within 2 weeks, Marcus had installed monitoring systems throughout our facilities that tracked everything from individual worker productivity to equipment utilization rates. He created dashboards that displayed real-time metrics on screens throughout the plant floor, turning craftsmanship into numbers that flashed red or green depending on predetermined efficiency targets. "This is revolutionary," Marcus announced during a department head meeting, gesturing toward a wall-mounted screen that showed Maria Santos's welding crew performance in colorful bar charts. "For the first time, we can identify optimization opportunities in real time and implement corrective measures immediately." Maria raised her hand. "What happens when the computer says we're behind schedule, but we're actually ahead of where we need to be for quality control?" "The system accounts for quality metrics," Marcus replied confidently. "Productivity and quality are both quantifiable variables that can be optimized simultaneously." And what happens when the computer doesn't understand that this particular steel batch requires longer heating cycles because of its metallurgical composition? Marcus smiled the patronizing smile of someone who had never worked with his hands. That's exactly the kind of institutional knowledge we're working to document and systematize. Individual expertise is valuable, but it's not scalable. The third change was the most unsettling. Victoria began hosting monthly leadership alignment sessions that brought together department heads, senior supervisors, and key personnel for what she called strategic communication and culture development. These sessions took place in our main conference room, which had been redesigned with new furniture, upgraded audio-visual equipment, and motivational posters that looked like they'd been borrowed from a corporate consulting firm. During these sessions, Victoria would present updates on our transformation roadmap and lead discussions about optimizing our organizational culture for scalable growth. She invited guest speakers, consultants, former Pentagon officials, executives from major defense contractors, who talked about industry best practices and modernization strategies. The sessions themselves weren't problematic. What bothered me was watching longtime employees nod politely at presentations that fundamentally misunderstood how Hayes Manufacturing actually worked. Jimmy Rodriguez, who had been perfecting his welding techniques for 30 years, listened to a consultant explain how, quote, standardized process documentation could eliminate variations in manufacturing outcomes. David Park, whose metallurgical innovations had saved us millions in material costs, sat through lectures about, quote, leveraging cross-functional synergies to optimize research and development initiatives. But the real erosion wasn't happening in conference rooms. It was happening in the subtle shifts that occur when an organization's fundamental character begins to change. Supervisors who used to make decisions based on their judgment and experience now required approval from Marcus Thompson's analytics department. Engineers who used to solve problems through direct communication with manufacturing teams now submitted requests through Jennifer Walsh's Strategic Coordination Office. The breaking point came during a crisis that should have demonstrated Hayes Manufacturing at its best. The USS Charleston, deployed with the Mediterranean Fleet, suffered critical damage to its propulsion system during a training exercise with NATO allies. The Navy needed replacement components that didn't exist in any inventory system, custom parts that would have to be designed, manufactured, and delivered to a port in Italy within 10 days. In the past, Admiral Mackenzie would have called me directly, we would have discussed the specifications, and I would have had teams working within hours. Instead, the request came through official Pentagon procurement channels, was processed by Jennifer Walsh's coordination office, and was assigned to Marcus Thompson's analytics team for resource allocation assessment and timeline optimization. 2 days later, 48 hours we couldn't afford to lose, I received a project summary that treated the USS Charleston emergency like a routine manufacturing request. Marcus had created a workflow chart that distributed responsibility across multiple departments, with built-in review stages and approval checkpoints that would add another week to the delivery timeline. This is insane, I told Victoria during an emergency meeting. While we're conducting timeline optimization assessments, the Charleston is sitting in an Italian port with compromised defensive capabilities. And that's exactly why we need systematic approaches to crisis management, Victoria replied. Emergency situations require clear protocols and defined responsibilities, not reactive improvisation. Emergency situations require people who understand the mission and have the authority to make immediate decisions, I countered. Admiral Mackenzie called us because she knew we could solve problems that other contractors couldn't handle. Now we're handling her emergency like it's a routine requisition request. We're handling it professionally, Michael, like a company that takes its responsibilities seriously. I walked out of that meeting and did something I hadn't done in 20 years of working with my sister. I went around her. I called Admiral Mackenzie directly, explained the situation, and assured her that Hayes Manufacturing would deliver the components on time regardless of our new organizational protocols. Then I did what I should have done from the beginning. I called Maria Santos, Jimmy Rodriguez, David Park, and Bobby Chen into my office and asked them to forget about workflow charts and approval checkpoints. The USS Charleston needed help, and we were going to provide it the way we always had, through expertise, dedication, and the understanding that sometimes American lives depend on getting the job done right. 7 days later, the components were delivered to the port in Naples. The Charleston was back at sea within 24 hours, rejoining her fleet with propulsion systems that were actually more robust than the original specifications. Admiral Mackenzie sent a personal letter of commendation that praised Hayes Manufacturing for exceptional responsiveness and technical innovation under emergency conditions. But Victoria's reaction to our success revealed how fundamentally our perspectives had diverged. Instead of celebrating the outcome, she focused on what she called process violations and unauthorized deviation from established protocols. "You completely undermined the organizational structure we've been building," she told me during a private meeting the day after the Charleston components were delivered. Jennifer and Marcus spent months developing coordination systems that ensure consistency and accountability. "And those systems would have failed our client when she needed us most," I replied. The Charleston emergency proved that all the organizational charts and analytics dashboards in the world can't replace people who understand their job and have the authority to do it. "It proved that you can't accept that Hayes Manufacturing is bigger than your personal relationships with military clients," Victoria shot back. "We're not a boutique contractor anymore, Michael. We're competing for billion-dollar contracts that require corporate discipline and strategic thinking." That conversation crystallized something I'd been sensing for months but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Victoria wasn't just trying to improve Hayes Manufacturing. She was trying to replace it with something that looked more impressive to Pentagon procurement committees, but would be fundamentally incapable of doing what had made us successful in the first place. The erosion accelerated after the Charleston incident. Victoria used our, quote, process violations as justification for implementing even more restrictive protocols. She hired additional consultants to develop comprehensive governance frameworks that would prevent future unauthorized decision-making. Most significantly, she convinced our board of directors that the company needed clearer executive authority to manage the complexity of our growing operations. "Michael's instincts have served us well," she told the board during a meeting I wasn't invited to attend. "But instincts aren't sufficient for the level of strategic coordination required by contracts like the Navy's $12 billion vessel program. We need leadership that understands modern defense procurement at the highest levels." Harold Morrison, our longest-serving board member, called me after that meeting with news that felt like a body blow. "Victoria's proposing a formal restructuring of executive responsibilities," he said. "She wants to become Chief Executive Officer, with you maintaining operational oversight as Chief Operating Officer." What does that mean for day-to-day decision-making? It means she would have final authority over strategic direction, client relationships, and major contracts. "You should focus on manufacturing operations and quality control." I hung up that phone call and realized that the systematic erosion had reached its intended destination. Victoria had spent months building a case that Hayes Manufacturing needed the kind of leadership only she could provide. The Charleston incident, which should have demonstrated the value of direct accountability and personal relationships, had instead been reframed as evidence that our traditional approach was incompatible with modern defense contracting. The takeover wasn't happening through hostile action. It was happening through patient, methodical transformation of our company into something that would require Victoria's particular skills, while marginalizing everything that had made us successful in the first place. But Victoria had made one crucial miscalculation. She assumed that the Pentagon procurement committees she'd been courting would value corporate structure over operational excellence. She was about to discover that in the defense industry, reputation isn't built in boardrooms. It's forged in moments when failure isn't an option and only results matter. The call came at 11:30 on a Thursday night in September. General Patricia Morrison's voice carried the weight of someone who'd been making impossible decisions for 30 years. But this time, there was something different. A carefully controlled urgency that made me sit up in bed and reach for a pen. "Michael, I need to speak with you privately, not through your new coordination office, not through official channels, just you and me, tomorrow morning, Redstone Arsenal. Can you be there by 0700? "Of course, General. What's the situation?" "Something that requires the Hayes Manufacturing I've worked with for 8 years, not the corporate entity your sister's been representing to procurement committees." I drove to Huntsville that night, checking into a hotel near the arsenal and spending the sleepless hours thinking about what General Morrison might need that couldn't be discussed through normal channels. Redstone Arsenal was where the Army developed its most advanced missile and space technologies, not the kind of place where routine manufacturing contracts were discussed. General Morrison met me at the main gate at dawn, wearing civilian clothes and driving her personal vehicle instead of an official Army car. We drove in silence to a small conference room in Building 4488, a nondescript structure that housed some of the most classified defense research in the country. "What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room," she began, sliding a folder across the table. 3 weeks ago, our intelligence assets identified a critical vulnerability in Chinese missile defense systems. It's a brief window, maybe 6 months, where we could deploy countermeasures that would maintain American technological superiority for the next decade. I opened the folder and saw technical specifications for components I'd never encountered before. Precision metal work that would require tolerances measured in microns. Exotic alloy compositions that would need to be developed from scratch. Manufacturing processes that didn't exist in any textbook. "The problem," General Morrison continued, "is that this project requires a contractor who can work outside normal procurement channels. No public records, no congressional oversight, no paper trail that could compromise operational security. Most importantly, we need someone who can deliver results without asking questions that can't be answered." "What's the timeline?" 4 months for prototype development, 2 months for full production, and Michael. She paused, making sure I understood the weight of what she was about to say. "If this project fails, or if details leak to the wrong people, American military superiority in the Pacific could be compromised for a generation." I studied the specifications again, mentally cataloging the resources we'd need, the personnel who could handle this level of classified work, the manufacturing processes that would have to be invented rather than implemented. It was exactly the kind of project that Hayes Manufacturing had been built to handle: impossible deadlines, unprecedented technical challenges, and stakes that went far beyond profit margins. "We can do it," I said. "But not through the corporate structure my sister's been building. This requires direct communication, immediate decision-making authority, and people who understand that mission success matters more than process compliance." General Morrison nodded. "That's exactly why I called you instead of going through official channels. But Michael, there's something else you need to understand. This project comes with a designation that will change everything." She pulled out a second document, this one bearing seals and signatures that I recognized from the highest levels of military command. "Effective immediately, this project operates under Special Access Program protocols. You'll be designated as the primary industrial partner, with direct reporting authority to my office and full autonomy over manufacturing decisions." I read the document twice before the implications sank in. Special Access Program designation meant that Hayes Manufacturing would be operating under the same security protocols as major defense contractors like Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works division. More importantly, it meant that our project would be insulated from normal corporate oversight, including oversight from executives who didn't have the necessary security clearances. "General, my sister won't have clearance for this level of classified work." "I know." Her expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. "Victoria's been positioning herself as Hayes Manufacturing's primary Pentagon liaison, but SAP designation requires personal security review at the highest levels. Her fellowship connections won't be sufficient for this level of access." Over the next week, I quietly began assembling the team we'd need for General Morrison's project. Maria Santos, Jimmy Rodriguez, David Park, and Bobby Chen all passed expedited security reviews. Their years of experience with classified military contracts had already established their reliability. But the real foundation of our capability was something that couldn't be measured by Victoria's analytics systems or documented in Marcus Thompson's process charts. It was the institutional knowledge that comes from 15 years of solving problems that other contractors couldn't handle. When David Park saw the exotic alloy specifications, he immediately understood which suppliers could source the raw materials without triggering international attention. When Maria Santos reviewed the precision welding requirements, She knew which techniques could achieve the necessary tolerances while maintaining structural integrity under extreme conditions. Most importantly, when Bobby Chen analyzed the logistics requirements, he realized that normal shipping channels would be inadequate for maintaining operational security. Instead, he developed a transportation plan that used military cargo aircraft in secure facilities, ensuring that no commercial carriers would have access to components that could reveal the project's purpose. While we were building the capability to handle General Morrison's project, Victoria was focused on a very different kind of preparation. She'd convinced the board to schedule a formal vote on executive restructuring for early October, a meeting where she expected to be officially designated as Chief Executive Officer. The Navy's Procurement Committee has indicated that corporate leadership structure will be a significant factor in their contract evaluations, she told Harold Morrison during one of their private conversations. They want to work with executives who understand strategic coordination at the Pentagon level. What Victoria didn't realize was that her Pentagon connections were primarily with procurement bureaucrats and policy analysts, people who understood budgets and timelines, but had never been responsible for operational success in life-or-death situations. Her fellowship had given her access to meetings and conferences, but it hadn't given her the kind of relationships that were built in secure facilities when American lives depended on getting the details right. The contrast became clear when General Morrison's project moved into full production. While Victoria was preparing presentations for the board meeting that would make her CEO, I was working 18-hour days with teams who understood that failure wasn't just about losing a contract, it was about compromising national security. The manufacturing challenges were unlike anything we'd encountered before. The precision requirements pushed our equipment to its absolute limits. The exotic alloys required heating and cooling cycles that had to be precisely timed to avoid microscopic structural flaws. Most critically, the entire production process had to be completed without leaving any documentation that could be reverse-engineered by foreign intelligence services. But our team rose to meet every challenge. Jimmy Rodriguez developed welding techniques that achieved tolerances no commercial contractor could match. Maria Santos implemented quality control procedures that caught defects measured in thousandths of inches. David Park solved metallurgical problems that would have taken university research teams months to understand. By mid-October, we were ahead of schedule on a project that most defense contractors would have considered impossible. General Morrison visited our facility twice, each time expressing amazement at what she was seeing. "This is exactly why we came to Hayes Manufacturing," she told me during her second visit. "Major contractors would have assigned this project to committees and subcontractors. You're handling it like a special operations mission. Small team, direct communication, absolute focus on results." The success of General Morrison's project had consequences that Victoria couldn't have anticipated. Word spread through classified channels that Hayes Manufacturing had delivered something unprecedented under conditions that tested every aspect of our capabilities. Defense officials who made decisions about the most sensitive military projects began to understand that our company represented something unique in the defense industry. 3 days before the board meeting, where Victoria expected to become CEO, I received a call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and carried the authority of someone who had spent decades at the highest levels of American military command. "Mr. Hayes, this is General William Patterson, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I understand you've been working on a project with General Morrison that has exceeded all expectations." "Yes, sir, General." "I need to meet with you personally to discuss expanding that relationship. Can you be in Washington tomorrow morning?" "Of course, General." "Good. And Mr. Hayes, bring documentation of your company's current leadership structure. We may need to discuss some changes." As I hung up that phone, I realized that Victoria's systematic erosion of Hayes Manufacturing had created an unintended consequence. Her efforts to transform our company into something that looked impressive to Pentagon procurement committees had obscured what actually made us valuable to the people who mattered most: the military leaders who were responsible for protecting American interests around the world. General Morrison's project had reminded those leaders that Hayes Manufacturing wasn't just another defense contractor. We were a national security asset that operated at a level of excellence that couldn't be replicated through corporate restructuring or process optimization. The quiet revolution had begun, and Victoria was about to discover that in the defense industry, relationships built on operational excellence carry more weight than any organizational chart. The Pentagon conference room was smaller than I'd expected for a meeting with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General William Patterson sat across from me at a polished table that reflected the morning light streaming through bulletproof windows. Two other officials flanked him, Admiral Rebecca Stone from Naval Operations and General Marcus Foster from Army Materiel Command. "Mr. Hayes," General Patterson began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who briefed the President on matters of national security, "General Morrison's project exceeded every performance metric we established. More importantly, it demonstrated capabilities that we believed had been lost in the American defense industry." He opened a folder that contained photographs of the components we'd manufactured. Precision tolerances that major contractors said were impossible. Delivery timelines that procurement analysts said were unrealistic. Most significantly, operational security that protected classified specifications throughout the entire manufacturing process. Admiral Stone leaned forward. "What General Patterson is saying, Mr. Hayes, is that Hayes Manufacturing represents something we thought no longer existed, a defense contractor that prioritizes mission success over profit optimization." "That's always been our approach, Admiral." "We know," General Foster interjected, "which is why we need to discuss your company's future direction." General Patterson pulled out a second folder, this one significantly thicker. "We've been monitoring the corporate restructuring your sister has been implementing. The consultants, the process documentation, the organizational changes designed to make Hayes Manufacturing look like every other major contractor." My stomach tightened. "Sir?" "Mr. Hayes, in 3 hours your board of directors will vote to designate Victoria Hayes as Chief Executive Officer. If that happens, Hayes Manufacturing will become subject to the same bureaucratic constraints that have compromised every other mid-sized defense contractor we've worked with." Admiral Stone opened her own folder. "We've seen this pattern before. Family companies get acquired or restructured by executives who understand Pentagon procurement but don't understand operational requirements. Within 2 years, they're incapable of handling the projects that made them valuable in the first place." "Which brings us to why you're here," General Patterson continued. "The Department of Defense is prepared to offer Hayes Manufacturing a prime strategic partnership designation, the highest level of contractor relationship we maintain. It comes with guaranteed funding, priority project access, and direct communication channels that bypass normal procurement processes." I stared at the documents he was sliding across the table. Prime Strategic Partnership was a designation I'd heard about but never seen, reserved for contractors whose capabilities were considered essential to national security. "There's one requirement," General Foster said quietly. "The partnership can only be established with contractors whose leadership structure ensures operational autonomy and direct accountability. Corporate oversight that interferes with mission-critical decision-making is incompatible with the security protocols this designation requires." General Patterson's next words landed like artillery shells. "If Victoria Hayes becomes CEO of Hayes Manufacturing, we cannot offer this partnership. If the current operational leadership structure is preserved, we can formalize the agreement this afternoon." The choice was stark, immediate, and non-negotiable. Either Hayes Manufacturing would continue down Victoria's path toward corporate efficiency and lose access to the projects that defined our purpose, or we would preserve the operational structure that had made us successful and gain recognition as a strategic national asset. "General, with all due respect, this isn't just my decision to make. Our board of directors—" "Mr. Hayes," Admiral Stone interrupted, "we've already spoken with Harold Morrison and your other board members. They understand the implications of both paths." I felt the ground shifting beneath everything I thought I understood about corporate governance and family business dynamics. The military leadership that controlled America's most sensitive defense projects had intervened directly in Hayes Manufacturing's internal structure. "There's something else," General Patterson added. "The prime strategic partnership includes a provision for executive designation. You would be designated as Chief Executive Officer with full operational authority, accountable directly to this office for all partnership-related activities." The meeting ended with handshakes that felt like battlefield promotions. As I walked through the Pentagon's corridors toward the exit, I understood that the next few hours would determine not just the future of Hayes Manufacturing, but the continuation of everything Grandfather Hayes had built. The drive back to Birmingham gave me 3 hours to process what had just happened. The Department of Defense had essentially chosen sides in our family conflict, backing operational excellence over corporate restructuring. But they'd also placed me in an impossible position. Accepting their offer meant directly opposing Victoria's ambitions in a way that would end our relationship permanently. I arrived at Hayes Manufacturing 30 minutes before the board meeting was scheduled to begin. Victoria was already in the conference room, wearing a navy blue suit that projected executive authority and reviewing notes for the presentation that would make her CEO. Marcus Thompson and Jennifer Walsh flanked her, armed with laptops and documents supporting the leadership transition. Our father, Thomas Hayes, sat at the head of the table looking older than his 72 years. Harold Morrison and the other board members wore expressions that suggested they'd already had conversations I wasn't aware of. "Michael," Victoria said as I entered, "perfect timing. I was just reviewing the final transition protocols with the board." I took my usual seat, placing a single folder on the table in front of me. "Before we proceed with any votes, I need to share some information that affects our decision-making." Victoria's confident expression flickered slightly. "What kind of information?" "The kind that determines whether Hayes Manufacturing continues to exist as we know it." I opened my folder and distributed copies of the Prime Strategic Partnership documentation to each board member. The room fell silent as they read through terms that represented the highest level of government contractor designation. "This morning I met with General William Patterson, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff," I began. "The Department of Defense is prepared to offer Hayes Manufacturing a partnership that would guarantee our future as a strategic national asset." Harold Morrison looked up from the documents. "These terms are extraordinary, Michael. This level of partnership comes with specific requirements," I continued. "The Pentagon cannot work with contractors whose corporate structure interferes with operational decision-making. They need direct accountability and immediate response capability." Victoria's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "Michael, this is clearly an attempt to undermine the modernization process we've been implementing." "No, Victoria. This is recognition that the modernization process you've been implementing would destroy everything that makes Hayes Manufacturing valuable." Thomas Hayes spoke for the first time since I'd entered the room. "What exactly are you saying, son?" "I'm saying we have a choice. We can continue down the path Victoria has outlined. Corporate restructuring, process optimization, and integration with major defense contractors. We'll become more profitable, more scalable, and completely incapable of handling the projects that have defined our reputation." I pulled out the second document General Patterson had given me. "Or we can accept designation as a prime strategic partner, preserve our operational autonomy, and become one of 12 contractors in the country with direct access to the most critical defense projects." "Huh?" Victoria stood abruptly. "This is manipulation, pure and simple. The Pentagon is interfering with legitimate corporate governance to preserve an outdated management structure." "The Pentagon is protecting a national security asset," I replied. "General Morrison's project proved that Hayes Manufacturing can deliver results that no other contractor can match. But only if we maintain the structure that makes those results possible." Harold Morrison cleared his throat. "Victoria, these partnership terms represent opportunities we never imagined possible. But Michael's right about the requirements. They're incompatible with the organizational changes you've proposed. Because they're designed to be incompatible." Victoria's composure finally cracked. "This is a setup to preserve Michael's control over a company that needs strategic leadership he's incapable of providing." Thomas Hayes looked at his daughter with sadness that went deeper than business disagreements. "Victoria, you've spent 2 years trying to fix problems that didn't exist. Hayes Manufacturing was successful because of the relationships Michael built, the reputation he earned, and the capabilities he developed. Your improvements would have eliminated everything that made us valuable." The vote, when it came, was unanimous. The board accepted the Prime Strategic Partnership and designated me as Chief Executive Officer with full operational authority. Victoria's corporate restructuring plan was terminated, her consultants dismissed, and her vision of Hayes Manufacturing as a major defense contractor officially abandoned. But the real reckoning came after the meeting ended, when Victoria and I stood alone in the conference room that had witnessed the destruction of her ambitions. "You'll regret this, Michael," she said quietly. "You chose to stay small, stay limited, stay exactly where grandfather left you." "I chose to stay excellent," I replied, "to preserve something that matters more than profit margins or corporate growth." Victoria gathered her materials and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back with a smile that held no warmth. "You think you've won something here, but you've just locked yourself into being exactly what you've always been: useful." The word hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Useful. The same word she'd use months later during our final confrontation, when she would discover that sometimes being useful was more powerful than being impressive. 6 months after the board meeting that changed everything, Hayes Manufacturing operated with a clarity of purpose we'd never experienced before. The prime strategic partnership had opened doors to projects that most defense contractors never knew existed. Our security clearances had been upgraded to levels that required monthly briefings from intelligence officials. Most importantly, we were working on technologies that would protect American military personnel for decades to come. But the real transformation wasn't in our contracts or our capabilities. It was in the culture that emerged when a company stops trying to be something it isn't and starts perfecting what it already does best. Maria Santos now led a specialized welding division that worked exclusively on classified projects. Her team of 12 craftsmen had security clearances equivalent to nuclear weapons specialists and took pride in creating components that would never be publicly acknowledged, but would save lives in ways that couldn't be measured. David Park directed our Advanced Materials Research Laboratory, where he developed alloy compositions that pushed the boundaries of metallurgical science. His innovations were being implemented across multiple branches of the military, giving American forces technological advantages that our adversaries couldn't match. Bobby Chen managed logistics operations that coordinated with military transportation networks around the world. When emergency components needed to reach American forces in remote locations, Bobby's systems ensured delivery with the precision of a special operations mission. The contrast with Victoria's corporate vision couldn't have been more stark. Instead of becoming a larger, more conventional defense contractor, we had evolved into something unique, a strategic national asset that operated at the intersection of advanced manufacturing and national security. The vindication came in ways I never expected. General Patterson's office contacted us monthly with projects that tested our capabilities and expanded our reputation within the most classified circles of American defense planning. We weren't just building components. We were developing technologies that would determine the outcome of conflicts that might not occur for years. But perhaps the most satisfying recognition came from an unexpected source. 8 months after our board restructuring, I received a call from Admiral Mackenzie with news that validated everything we'd chosen to preserve. "Michael, I wanted you to know that the USS Charleston, the ship your team saved during that emergency repair, has been selected as the flagship for the Pacific Fleet's next deployment. The modifications your people made during that crisis have become the standard for the entire class of vessels." "I'm glad we could help, Admiral." "You did more than help. The propulsion improvements David Park developed during that emergency repair have enhanced performance across our entire Pacific presence." When military historians write about this deployment, they'll never mention Hayes Manufacturing. But every sailor who comes home safely will owe part of their survival to work that happened in your facility. Those words captured everything that made Hayes Manufacturing meaningful. We weren't building monuments to corporate success or chasing recognition that would fade with the next quarterly report. We were protecting people who put their lives on the line for American values around the world. Victoria had been wrong about almost everything, but she'd been right about one thing. I had chosen to stay exactly where Grandfather Hayes had left me. The difference was understanding that this was exactly where we belonged. 3 years later, when defense industry analysts published reports about the most innovative contractors in America, Hayes Manufacturing rarely appeared in their rankings. We were too small, too specialized, too focused on classified work that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The companies that dominated those lists were the ones Victoria had wanted us to emulate: large, profitable, and impressive to people who measured success in stock prices and market share. But in the secure conference rooms where America's military leaders planned for threats that couldn't be discussed in congressional hearings, Hayes Manufacturing was recognized as indispensable. When General Patterson needed contractors who could solve problems that didn't have textbook solutions, he called us. When Admiral Stone faced logistics challenges that commercial suppliers couldn't handle, she knew we would deliver. When operations required manufacturing capabilities that existed nowhere else in the American defense industry, Hayes Manufacturing was the answer. The company grandfather Hayes had built in a converted airplane hangar had evolved into exactly what he'd envisioned: a place where American craftsmanship created solutions that made the world safer. Not through corporate expansion or strategic partnerships with foreign suppliers, but through the dedication of people who understood that their work mattered in ways that couldn't be quantified on quarterly reports. Looking back, I realized that Victoria's greatest mistake hadn't been misunderstanding Hayes Manufacturing. It had been misunderstanding what success actually meant. She'd seen our reputation and relationships as stepping stones to something larger, never realizing that they were destinations in themselves. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that preserve rather than transform, that protect rather than expand, that choose excellence over growth. Hayes Manufacturing had become exactly what it was supposed to be: not the biggest defense contractor in America, but the most trusted. When young engineers toured our facilities now, they saw something that didn't exist anywhere else in the industry. They saw craftsmen who took personal responsibility for the quality of their work, supervisors who made decisions based on mission requirements rather than corporate protocols, and leaders who understood that in the defense industry, reputation isn't built through marketing campaigns. It's forged through consistency, reliability, and the absolute certainty that when American lives depend on your work, you will deliver. Victoria had called me useful, and she'd been right. But she'd never understood that being useful, truly, meaningfully useful, was the highest achievement any company could reach. We weren't just another defense contractor competing for market share. We were guardians of capabilities that couldn't be replaced, protectors of knowledge that couldn't be replicated, and stewards of a mission that went far beyond profit margins. In the end, that was Grandfather Hayes's true legacy: not the buildings or the contracts or the financial success, but the understanding that some things matter more than growth, and some victories are worth preserving rather than expanding. Hayes Manufacturing had found its place in the world, and we intended to keep it. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.